Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to talk a little bit about spending today, like my friend and colleague from Arizona, but I'm going to talk about spending of a different kind. I'm going to talk about campaign spending. Campaign spending is quite an issue, and I want to spend about an hour or less talking about its effect. I want to talk about some of the solutions that we have out there that might make a big difference. But first I want to say I truly believe in the heart of my hearts that the United States of America is the greatest country in the world, probably the greatest country that the world has ever seen and may see in the future. And you can just see that by some of the markers, the notions of freedom that this country has had in the past, have inspired nations, they've inspired individuals around the world. Our economic strength is unrivaled. Our cultural influence reaches every corner of the world, and our military power is absolutely unrivaled. However, again, I truly believe that we can do better. And I'll tell you some of the big challenges that we're facing right now, that if we take on these challenges, we will even be a greater nation. First of all, we need massive investments in our nation's infrastructure, our highways, our bridges, our ports, our airports. We need it in our broadband. We just need a massive amount of investment in our nation's infrastructure. Our nation's education is falling behind. Yes, we have some of the greatest schools, some of the greatest universities in the entire world. Some of our public schools, some of our charter schools and private schools, unrivaled. But there's a lot of schools that are struggling and producing students that really can't compete in today's world. We need to do immigration reform. We have 12, 15 million people in this country that are undocumented, that live in the shadows, that may or may not pay taxes, that contribute to our economy, but are always afraid of being deported. We have climate change. Climate change is here. It's progressing. It's going to get worse. We need to do something about it as soon as possible. We have a vanishing middle class. There's a huge disparity in incomes between the richest and the poorest in this country, and it's increasing. Our middle class is vanishing. They're feeling more and more insecure. They're unable to send their kids to college. So we have a huge challenge in that regard. We have a need to establish background checks for purchase of weapons and to close the gun show loopholes. We need to create a sustainable economy. And these are huge challenges that we need to attend from the Congress, from this body, from the House of Representatives, from the United States Senate, from the state legislatures, from local governments. But we're unable to attack these problems in a large part because of the way campaigns are financed. And now we see a growing perversion of presidential campaigns. We have super PACs, we have dark donors, and they're having meetings with presidential candidates which are allowed by the laws because the candidates are not official candidates. No one knows what's legal and enforceable right now in presidential candidate financing. And worse than that, foreign money is probably coming into all of these campaigns now. And I just want to say elections up and down the ballot are being more and more perverted each election. All Americans should be concerned. While I was waiting to speak this evening, I just read an article in the National Journal Daily today that stated, according to data gathered in 21 states by the National Institute of Money and State Politics, $175 million was spent in them in 2006. That's local politics. That's city council and school boards. A number that was ballooned to $245 million just 4 years later. That's a delta of $70 million increases in local campaign financing in just 4 years. And that's a fraction of the total expected to be spent in future local races. But before I go further, what I'd like to do is take a break and introduce my friend and colleague from North Carolina, Walter Jones, and he wants to say a few words. And I yield to Walter.
Mr. McNerney, thank you very much, and I want to thank you for taking the lead tonight to be on the floor. I know you will have other members of Congress to join you in your hour, but I've been here for 20 years, and I must tell you that since I've been here, I've never seen as much influence by the special interests as I do now, and that's because of money. Both parties, and that's why you're a Democrat, I'm a Republican, but both parties seem to succumb to the influence of money to get bills to the floor. I am a strong supporter of John Sarbanes, who's from Maryland. You have your bill, and that I've joined today, by the way, to sign my name to, your resolution. And I'm on John Sarbanes' bill, which is H.R. 20. The title is the Government by the People Act, and I'll touch on 4 quick points. Building a government of and by and for the people. The second part of the bill says empower the Americans to participate. The third part is amplify the voice of the people. Fight back against big money special interests. And in my few minutes, Mr. McNerney, what I'd like to talk about is the influence of money. I am a Republican and proud to be one. You're a Democrat and proud to be one. But I would tell you that I've seen so many bills this year get to the floor of the House because, in my opinion, it's because of the influence of special interests. You and I recently had a bill on the floor that basically said that we would change the law that would allow the mobile home companies that sell mobile homes to many people. In my district, 45,000 people own mobile homes, and there'll be others buying mobile homes, but they would change the contract to say that it would go from 8 to 12%. Well, who did it benefit? Warren Buffett. I don't deny Warren Buffett his success. He's a very successful man, and I'm happy for him. But what this bill did was to say to the average person that maybe in California or North Carolina that needs to buy a mobile home because that's the best they can do, we're going to let you pay more in interest. I was the only Republican to vote no on that bill. I said this back in my district, and quite frankly, I was pleased that the majority of people agree with me that we should be considerate of those people who cannot afford to buy better than a mobile home. But there again, that's special interest influence. That's what you just said a moment ago. I'm of the firm belief that if we do not change the system, you have an HJ resolution that you've introduced. I talk about John Sarbanes' H.R. 20 that will create an alternative to the system that we have. You and I both know that Citizens United, that said that a corporation is an individual, has created a lot of the problems that we face today. And I will say that the American people need to get behind what you're trying to do, what Mr. Sarbanes is trying to do, and I, in a lesser way, to return the power of the people to the people. Because too many times decisions here in Washington are made because special interests, whether it be a Democrat or Republican leadership, puts it on the floor. And I believe that the people, as you believe, have a right to let this be the people's house and not the special interest house. So I'm delighted to be on the floor with you tonight. I will stay just a few minutes. If you want to call back on me in a couple of minutes, I'll be here till a little bit after 8. But I wanted to thank you for getting on the floor tonight to speak about this issue, because if we're going to let the people own the government, then we must give the power back to the people. I yield back to you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. And I just want to point out, again, that this is bipartisan. Mr. Jones is a Republican. I'm a Democrat. We both see the corrosive influence of money here in Washington, and we want to do something about it. A lot of our colleagues agree with us wholeheartedly, but are actually afraid to say it. They're afraid to get up here because they know that if they do, they're going to be targeted by this special interest money, by super PAC money, by dark money. And the sad thing is that you don't know that it's coming. You could be running a good, solid, healthy campaign, arguing the issues, and then all of a sudden see a $2 million television ad buy against you, and they would be going after you for very personal, misleading ads which could destroy you and your family for no reason other than you don't want to see so much money in campaign spending. But let me look at some of the specific risks and problems that we see today because of the way campaigns are financed. First of all, campaign financing makes elected officials less effective in their jobs because of the time you have to spend raising money. Here in Congress, it's not unusual to see a member of Congress spend 2, 4, 6 hours a day on the phone begging people for money. That lessens your effectiveness. You can't spend that time. You should be spending that time studying legislation, talking to colleagues, finding ways to compromise on issues. The second item is negative campaign ads turn off voters and suppress votes. We see in this last election turnout of 40%, 35%, 30% in some districts, and a lot of that has to do with the negativity that people see on the TV. They don't know what to believe. They think they're both bums, and they just close their nose and vote for the least worst, or they don't vote at all. So that's the second effect. Campaign financing makes for wasteful government spending. Now, this is an issue that I think folks like my predecessor here tonight was talking about. The Tea Party folks should be interested in this issue because the way campaigns are financed causes wasteful government spending. And boy, I tell you, I sympathize with the Tea Party objectives. Government seems big, it seems wasteful, it seems loaded, it seems ineffective. There's wasteful spending, there's projects that shouldn't be funded. Well, a lot of that has to do with the way campaigns are financed. The next one is the threat, and this is a big one, this is important, it's kind of what I mentioned before. The threat of negative campaign ads causes elected officials to avoid important and controversial issues. Now, I don't care if you're a Republican or a Democrat. If you're a Republican, you have risk in your primary elections. If you're a Democrat, for big money coming in and trying to trash you personally in election campaigns. If you're a Democrat, you have more risk coming in general elections. So it doesn't matter what party you're in. It doesn't matter whether you're conservative or liberal. The way campaigns are financed is causing our government to be wasteful. It's causing it to be ineffective, and I think that needs to be improved. Another problem, and I mentioned this earlier, foreign money is coming into these campaigns now. Do you want to see foreigners, do you want to see folks from Russia, from China, from any country besides the United States having an influence on our elections? And now the amount of money coming into elections continues to grow election by election. We had $6.2 million in $6.2 million in 2010 versus $3 billion in 2020. I think I've got a million or a billion mixed up there. Sorry about that. Elected officials respond more to wealthy donors than they do to non-wealthy donors. It's simply a matter of access. Someone gives you money, you know, they're more likely to have access. And that means that you're more likely to be sympathetic to their legislative goals. Judicial races are getting more expensive and tainted as well. Do you want to have a judge in a case that you may be bringing to court get his seat or her seat because of the way the campaign finance trashed their opponent? I don't think so. And in general, people have become very cynical about government because of the negative advertising. People lose faith in our government, and you know, to have the greatest country in the world, to have the things that this country has accomplished, the innovation, the science, the freedoms that we've established throughout the world, and have people cynical about our government because of campaign financing is more than a tragedy. Campaigns spending is a zero-sum game, and let me tell you what I mean by that. Consider that you're in a meeting. You've got a 1 hour, and you've got 12 people. So everyone has 5 minutes to speak. Now, what if somebody takes 10 minutes? Well, then somebody else is going to lose out. So campaign speak is like that too, because people in this country are only willing to listen to a certain amount of campaign rhetoric. And then after that point, they turn off their minds. They don't want to hear anymore. And so the folks with the biggest money, they get out there, they fill the airwaves, they fill your mailboxes, they have people knocking at your doors. Pretty soon you don't want to hear anymore. And so the guy with the lesser money is losing freedom of speech. So I think it's a freedom of speech issue. So those are some of the issues I have. And with PACs and super PACs and dark money, this is an interesting one. Campaigns are no longer going to be controlled by the candidates. You could have a situation where super PACs and PACs have 5 times more money than the candidate himself or herself, in which case they're controlling all the levers in the campaign. So those are some of the issues that I think are caused by the excessive spending in our campaigns. And right now I'd like to again yield to Walter and take up the case there.
Thank you, Mr. McNerney. I appreciate listening to you, and it reminds me of a conversation I had on the floor of the House last week. As you know, I've been here 20 years. I came with Newt Gingrich, and Bill Clinton was the president, and we did some good things for the American people, so I'm kind of an older man, so to speak. And I vote my conscience up here. It gets me in trouble. I voted twice against the Speaker of the House. That got me in trouble. But, you know, I do what I think is right. And I was sitting on the floor, and this gentleman will not say his name or where he's from because I don't have permission to do that. But he came up to me and said, Walter, he said, I'm probably going to, he's 20 years younger than I am. I'm 72 now. And he said, I'm probably going to be like you. I'll be, and he's a Republican. He said, I'll probably be like you and never be a chairman or ranking member of anything because I cannot do anything that would dampen or threaten my integrity. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, in January, I was told that I could be a subcommittee chairman, but I'd have to raise $300,000. The point that you're trying to make tonight, and you're doing a good job, and I've tried to say with the John Sarbanes bill, H.R. 20, and I hope people look that up as well as your resolution, is that this too oftentimes, and I'll say both parties, we have people in leadership that say you have to raise X amount of dollars if you want to be a chairman. And what happens to that person in eastern North Carolina, where I'm from, who makes $35,000 or $40,000 a year, that can't buy influence in Washington? That's what you're trying to do tonight. That's why I wanted to be with you and admire you for taking the floor tonight. Where are their spokesmen? We are the people's house. And all of a sudden, everything is about money, winning re-elections with money, big money, and the average citizen is beginning to be turned off by the fact that they don't have much influence. And that's why what you're doing tonight is very special. And I was thinking to the gentleman that said to me that I'll be like you, Walter Jones. I'll probably never be a chairman or ranking member because you're trying to keep your integrity in place. Well, if we had a system that you're proposing and John Sarbanes are proposing that would have a system for those who don't want to be bought and paid for by special interests, they would have an alternative by rating in the state and in the district, and they would be rewarded for raising their money in that state. Then they would be, their allegiance would be to the state and the district. So therefore, again, I'm going to stay a few more minutes, but I want to compliment you on what you're doing tonight, and I'll yield back my time.
Well, thank you, Walter. And I don't know of anyone that has more integrity in this institution than you do, Walter. So I'm honored that you'd come down here and talk with me tonight about this important issue. Now, American people, as far as I can tell, are clearly in favor of reducing campaign money, campaign spending. I have some Gallup poll numbers here that were taken by the Huffington Post through November 7th through November 9th, 2014. So that was during the last election or right after the last election. First question, would you support or oppose amending the Constitution to give Congress more power to create restrictions on campaign spending? In favor of that was 53%, oppose is 23%, and not sure is 22%. So a very strong majority in favor of a constitutional amendment like I'm going to discuss in a little while. The second question, do you think limiting contributions to political campaigns helps prevent corruption in politics, or does it have no impact on corruption? So the question is, Will corruption be curtailed by limiting campaign spending? The answer, it helps prevent corruption, 52%. No impact on corruption, 28%. And not sure, 20%. So again, people feel strongly about this issue. The last question that I'll read is, which of the following statements do you agree with more? Elections are generally won by the candidate who raises the most money. The answer is 59% of Americans believe that, and 18% don't believe that, and 23% are unsure. So I think this is a strong issue that we should be talking about. So how do we move forward? Well, unfortunately, the Supreme Court appears to have a strong bias toward more money in politics and has consistently issued rulings to that effect. So the Supreme Court even sought out, they even asked for the infamous Citizens United case to be brought forward to them. And then ultimately they ruled that corporations have the same rights of free speech as individual citizens do, as individual people do. And the meaning of that decision is that corporations can use their treasuries. They can use their treasuries to campaign, to finance campaigns. I can't think of anything more corrosive or destructive to our democracy than that. The system was already bad before the Systems United decision, but this thing made it much worse. But unfortunately, the Citizens United decision is just one but a series of decisions that allow more and more money into politics. And I truly believe that this is a threat to our cherished democratic and Republican institutions. But this trend is not confined to the Supreme Court. Earlier this year, the Republican-controlled Senate, in concurrence with the Republican-controlled House of Representatives, passed legislation that increased the total individuals contribute to political parties by a factor of 10, going from $35,000 to over $300,000. So then what can we do about it? Well, the good news is that there's really a number of very good ideas that have been proposed, and I think it's important for us to go over some of those ideas. My friend Walter Jones has mentioned John Sarbanes' idea, and I'll go into that in a little bit of detail, but there's others, and I think it's important that the American people be aware of some of these proposals out there, what they might offer, and let them decide, let the American people decide. Do they want to see a legislative approach like John Sarbanes, a great approach, I support it, or a constitutional amendment like mine, and others that I'll bring up as we go forward tonight. These proposals all have merit. They're all worth studying and thinking about, and I would be happy to support any of the ones that I'm going to talk about this morning, this evening, and consider other ones that may not have been brought forward yet. So the proposals, again, fall into two categories: legislative proposals and constitutional amendments. Legislative proposals are a little bit easier to enact, but they're subject to Supreme Court and lower court overturning. So you can work hard, you can get it passed, and then have the Supreme Court or some other court overturn it. And then the constitutional amendments is a very high bar. It's very difficult to get a constitutional amendment passed, and it should be. You don't want people just willy-nilly passing amendments to change the Constitution, and they require a 2/3 vote in the House of Representatives, a 2/3 vote in the Senate, and 3/4 of the state legislatures throughout the country to pass that amendment for it to become part of the Constitution. But once it becomes part of the Constitution, the courts can't touch it. They can interpret it, but they can't overturn it. So the legislation that I'd like to talk about, some of my colleagues were going to be here tonight, couldn't because of a change of schedule, but I think one of the important approaches, mostly championed by Chris Van Hollen for Maryland, is the disclosure and transparency approach, that people that donate ought to be disclosed quickly and broadly so that people know where money is coming from. That's a very important idea. Government by the people, John Sarbanes' approach, which I will talk about in a little while. And there's also a legislation that would create public financing. And I think that's a very good approach, too. The constitutional amendments, there's one by Donna Edwards that overturns Citizens United. There's one by Ted Deutsch, a colleague of mine from Florida. By the way, Donna Edwards is from Maryland. Ted Deutsch from Florida would basically allow Congress to enact laws on campaign financing that could not be overturned by the Supreme Court. I think that's a good approach. I support that. In theory, it's got a beauty to it. And then there's my approach, which basically would eliminate PACs and do other things. So I'd like to talk in some detail about my resolution now, and we'll get up the board to talk about it. This is called House Joint Resolution 31. Again, it's a proposed constitutional amendment. And as you can see, it has 4 parts. The first part, I think, is probably the most important. And it says, basically, that money that comes into political election campaigns to support or oppose a candidate for office can only come from individual citizens and only go to the campaign controlled by the candidate, or the principal campaign controlled by the candidate, or from a system of public election financing. So what does that mean? That means that when money comes in, it can only come from individual citizens. It can't come from corporations. It can't come from any other sources. It just comes from individual citizens, and it can only go to the campaign controlled by the candidate. That means that it can't go to political action committees, PACs. It can't go to super PACs. It can't be dark money. The only money that can influence elections directly or indirectly to support or oppose a candidate has to come from individual citizens and has to go only to the candidate, the campaign controlled by the candidate. That's a very strong requirement. It's probably the strongest requirement out there right now, but I think it's important. The second measure is similar to the first, but applying to, and by the way, the first requirement applies to elections for individual candidates at all levels of government, from the president on down to the Congress, the Senate, state governments, city governments, and so on. The second requirement, money to support or oppose a state ballot initiative to change a state constitution for other purposes, can only come from individuals who are able to vote for the measure or from a system of public election financing. I think that's important because you have ballot initiatives in my home state of California, for example, and you see millions of dollars coming in from out of state. Why would somebody from out of state have an opportunity to influence a state ballot initiative in California? I think it's wrong, and I think that this would take care of that problem. The third requirement is that Congress, the states, and the local jurisdictions must establish limits that an individual can contribute to any one election campaign, including limits on the amount a candidate may contribute to his or her own campaign. Now, for that particular requirement, we already have that in the U.S. House, in the U.S. Senate. The limit at this point in time is $2,700 per election. So every time your voters can go to the booth for you, people can contribute, individuals can contribute $2,700. So the primary election, the general election, in the House of Representatives, elections are every 2 years. So you can collect an amount of $5,400 over the election cycle for your campaign. Now, if you collect $5,400 before the primary and you lose the primary, then you're going to have to give back the money that was generated, that was donated for the general election. So that would be, you'd have to give $2,700 back to the donors that gave that to you. And also, it's important that it limits that it requires governments to limit the amount a candidate can spend on their own campaign. Some of our candidates are extremely wealthy. They have millions or hundreds of millions or more. They can buy their seat in Congress easy, and this would limit that. I think, again, very, very important. And the last is probably one of the more controversial of the four, but it says that the total of contributions to a candidate's campaign from individuals who are not able to vote for the candidate cannot be greater than the total from contributions from individuals who can vote for the candidate. Now, geographically, what that would mean is that money coming from outside of your congressional district or from your state, if you're a senator, can't exceed money that comes from inside your district. If you're a congressional candidate, or state if you're a senator, wouldn't affect the presidential race as much because everybody in the United States is in the president's district, but it would also affect local districts as well. So with that wraps up the discussion of my proposed constitutional amendment. I want to talk a little bit about John Sarbanes' bill, and I think it's a fine bill. It's not a constitutional amendment, and what it does is it gives you a tax credit for money that you can contribute to a campaign. So if you can contribute $50 to a campaign, then you get a tax credit, $50, which means money back in your income tax returns. The same amount that you contribute, you get back. But also, it matches that contribution by 6 to 1. So you will end up giving the candidate quite a bit more than you're actually contributing. And it's a good measure. It's a good proposal. It would sort of even out the effect of PACs. And I find myself supporting that. Again, my colleague Ted Deutsch has a couple of constitutional amendments in the 114th Congress. One of them is called Democracy for All, HJ Res 119, and also HJ Res 22. And that creates funding limits and creates a distinction between individual and corporations. But what it really does is allows Congress to enact laws that will be enforceable and not overturned by the Supreme Court. We have Van Hollen in the 114th Congress, H.R. 430, and what this does is requires disclosure so that when campaign contributions are made, we can determine who made those contributions. Very important. I think it would make a big difference. And then we have a number of proposals to create public financing. My colleague from Kentucky, John Yarmouth, had one in the 113th Congress, Fair Elections Now Act. In the 114th Congress, which is this Congress, David Price has H.R. 424, which has established a system of public financing. These are all good. I think I would be supportive of any of these kinds of approaches. I think American public need to be protected. I think our cherished Democratic and Republican institutions are a threat here, whether it's because candidates are bombarded by negative ads, whether it's because candidates are influenced by big donors, whether it's because more and more money is coming into these elections every single cycle. There's a lot of reasons why we need to look at campaign financing and select one of these approaches and go with it and change the system that we have to a system that really does respond to the American public. With that, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to yield back.